When I was the minister of the church in Walmer, I volunteered on the local lifeboat, and I went through a lot of training to be able to operate the lifeboat and to be a valuable member of the crew there. And this week, as we've been looking at the news, and we see sometimes tragedies of people drowning as they go into, as they're swimming or getting into trouble, it took me down a little trip down memory lane. And I remembered a particular week where we'd rescued a young girl who had got into difficulty in the sea. And we literally got there just as she was going under, and we managed to save her life. And then we also had a dead body the same week. And it was the wife of a deacon of a church. She'd committed suicide, threw herself off of the cliffs of Dover. And we'd gone to pick the body up, and when I saw it was her, of course it wasn't a pleasant experience. And when we got back, the police were there, and I said, well, I know this woman, so they didn't have to do the research who it was, and we went round and told the husband and so forth. And it was a particularly difficult week. And at the time I was also doing further studies at Spurgeon's College. And so I went up there on the Monday, and we had we'd have the lectures and all the academic stuff, but then there'd be sort of like a pastoral support group, which you'd be part of. And as I sat in this group, most of them were younger than me, and they'd all be complaining about such trivial things quite often, just in absolute stress over things which you think, actually, in the bigger scheme of things, this isn't really, that big a deal. And I really I used to try and offer comfort and encouragement to these, people, even though I wasn't the one in charge of that particular group. And afterwards, the lecturer, a lady who was a professor and a lecturer in Old Testament studies, she said something to me which encouraged me very much. She said, Sean, how's your week been? I said, it's been fine. She said, has it? I said, yeah. I said, it's been fine. She said, I visited Walmer this week. I read in the paper. She said, your name was listed amongst the crew of the lifeboat who went out to those incidences. And she said, how do you feel about it? I said, well, I'm fine. I'm at peace in my heart about it. And she said, I thought you would be. She said, do you know what? She said, as we were driving into Walmer, we drove past your church. And I said to my husband, I said, I know the minister of that church. He attends my lectures at the college. And she said, my husband asked me, what sort of man is he? And she said, well, I would describe Sean like this. If you was in a 30-foot hole and water was cascading in and starting to fill up, he's the sort of man you'd want there to try and help you get out of the difficulty or out of the situation. And that was such a blessing to me. I've often thought of those words, and it was an encouragement to me that when people looking outside of your life looked into it, that somebody would actually say those words. And I think it's lessons that I've had to learn from the scriptures more than anything. And I love this passage this morning. We're going to read from Acts chapter 27, starting at verse 13. And I think this is one of the great passages of scripture. So let's read it, and then we'll say a few words about it. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the land. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Corda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the man had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Citrus, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. And on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Now see, this is Luke writing, and he was Paul's travelling companion. So he was actually there during this journey. And I'll just say this before we continue reading, that this is actually one of the most vivid and detailed accounts in ancient history of a journey by ship. There's no other account in history quite like this, which Luke's and people have tried to discredit it before. There used a time when they said, well, ships don't have 4 anchors, so this is just wrong. And two archaeologists discovered that ancient ships had 4 anchors, exactly as it said here. So this is a personal account of this journey. It's important to understand that as we continue to read. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice, not to set sail from Crete, and then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss." I love it. In the midst of all this, the Apostle Paul said, "I told you so." If you had listened to me, I told you so. And even he couldn't resist that temptation. And aren't we like that? If we say something and it happens, we can't give in to that temptation. I told you so. If only he'd have listened to me. I love it that Paul's as human as we are, that he just couldn't resist that "I told you so" statement there. But he didn't leave it there. It's no good somebody just saying "I told you so." He said, "I told you so. Now I'm going to tell you again. This is how we get out of this mess. This is what we need to do." He says, "But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.' And on the 14th night we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved.' So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away." Isn't it incredible that Paul had such faith and confidence, and even the Roman centurion, somebody who wasn't a Christian, had so much confidence in him that at his word they were willing to cut the lifeboats away? Paul, if you say your God has told you this, do it. And they cut the lifeboats away. I find that incredible. And it goes on, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." And after he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bale stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. And then if you read the rest of the account, you will see what happened when they got to the shore. and so forth. Let me ask you this question. What sort of person are you when the storms of life hit? What sort of person do you become? Do you become agitated, overwhelmed with a sense of hopelessness, burdened by stress and anxiety in the midst of the storm, where the words you speak discourage everybody? It's no good. God's let us down, and so forth. Or do you actually become an encourager rather than discourager? I've seen so many Christians who become like Corporal Jones from Dad's Army in a situation, running around, don't panic, when actually they're the most panicked people in the room. So many Christians are sometimes like that. The fact is, when the storms are raging, it's possible to remain calm, to find a solution, and act if we stand on the promises of God. So what I want to do this morning is just to give you 4 anchors, if you like. 4 things that you can actually rest your soul upon. And the first is the strong anchor of the presence of God. That even in the midst of that raging storm, Paul found that he was not alone. The Lord sent an angel to be with him, appeared to him, spoke to him. When the storms of life hit us, do you feel alone, or do you have the confidence and faith that the God who has said he will never leave or forsake you is still right by your side, even though the storm is raging around you? Every step of your life can be made with the assurance that God is with you, that his goodness and mercy follow you every single place you go. There's a story of a young boy growing up in a congested and bustling city. And his father arranged for a young teenage girl to walk him to school each day. And he paid her money each day to walk him to school. And the young boy found this a bit embarrassing, so he really argued with his dad. I really don't want this. He said, trust me, let me walk by myself. He said, trust me, it'll be okay. So the dad said, okay, I'll let you walk by yourself to do it. And so for the next 2 years, the little boy walked to school in the morning and walked back in the evening by himself. Years later, there was at a family gathering, and the boy was a man by this time. He started to boast. When I was a little boy, he said, I used to walk to school by myself. I was 5 years old. I used to walk there by myself and walk back in this busy city. And the dad laughed. No, you didn't. He said, every time you set out in the morning, he said, I followed you. He said, you didn't see me. He said, but I was watching you. I was looking out for you. I was making sure you were safe, that no harm would actually come to you. And I think that's a wonderful picture of God. We might not see him. We might not be aware physically that he's there. But when the storms are raging, you can have a sense of the strong anchor of the presence of God. The second anchor is the strong anchor of the promises of God. As Paul weathered that long, terrible storm, the Lord came to him with a precious promise. He reminded Paul that he would stand before Caesar and that all of those on the ship were to be spared as well. Now, this is incredible when you think about it, because God had said to Paul previously, he said, I'm going to send you to stand before Caesar in Rome. So here he is, Paul finds himself a prisoner. They're about to set sail. He's saying to people, don't set sail. I'm an experienced traveller. I've been involved in 3 shipwrecks before, if you look at what he writes to the Corinthians. So he knew a bit about storms and shipwrecks. He said, I'm telling you, he said, if we set sail, we're going to be in trouble. We're going to be in danger. They didn't listen to him. The foolishness of the men around him put Paul in that situation, but even their foolishness could not actually thwart the will of God, because God has said to him, you're going to stand before Caesar. I'm going to get you there. I'm going to make you there. So even though Paul couldn't control the circumstances around him, God was making sure that Paul would get to the place where he had told him he would be. The strong anchor of the promises of God. And in the scripture, there's 8,810 promises. Count them all afterwards if you don't believe me. 7,487 are promises that God makes to people. About 85% of all of the Bible's promises are those that God makes to people. Says, this is what I will do for you. I give you my word. I promise you. You can trust it. I will do it. I will fulfill it. There are 991 instances of somebody making a promise to another person. They don't always keep them. You see it when you read the Bible, when somebody says, I will do this for you, and they don't end up doing it for whatever reason. Some make foolish, insincere promises. Others make foolish promises where they don't have the ability or opportunity to keep it. And some make genuine promises where they do what they will say. There are 290 promises that people make to God in the Bible. Again, some of them are insincere. I've heard so many people make insincere promises to God. God, if you get me out of this situation, I promise I will do that for you. As soon as the situation's gone, the promise is forgotten. It's insincere. We see that in the Bible. Again, we see people make foolish promises to God, ones they cannot keep. But then we see people make genuine promises to God, ones they do. 290 promises that people make to God. There's others we could go. 29 promises made by angels. 9 promises made by the devil in the scripture, where he says, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the earth. It's a promise if you just do this for me. You know the story of Christ's encounter with him. 2 promises are made by an evil spirit. 2 are made by God the Father to God the Son. 1 book of the Bible contains no promises at all, the book of Titus. If you read that, not a single promise in there. Ephesians has only 6 promises. On the other hand, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel have over 1,000 promises. And the reason I'm telling you this, and if you read Psalm 37, practically every verse is a most wonderful promise. The reason I'm telling you this is because the Bible is a book of promises made by God to those who follow him. You look at it, he says, I promise you, this is what I will do. If you follow me, this is what I will do. And do you know what? He's faithful to every single one of them. Absolutely every single promise he's faithful to. So when you're in a storm, have faith, have confidence, have the power to endure. Claim the promises of God as an anchor for your soul as you sail the stormy seas of life, for they will anchor you safe and secure in any situation. Many Christians live like spiritual paupers despite the rich promises God has given to them. Peter said that he has given us precious and magnificent promises so that we can live the life he calls us to live. So you have the anchor of the promise of God. And God's promises are like a treasure chest. When you look at what he actually says, you realise how blessed we are. We'll go on to the third anchor. That's where I can find it. There we go. The strong anchor of the providence of God. Paul is told by God that this storm was a part of working God's plan out in Paul's life. Whenever I've gone through storms in my own life, in my ministry, in my personal life, they were horrendous at the time. They weren't pleasant. No storm is. Nobody enjoys being in the midst of a storm. I love watching thunderstorms myself, if I'm safely indoors, looking out the window at the lightning and listening to the thunder. But you know, if you're out in the open and you're exposed and there's lightning cracking the trees around you and stuff like that, it's not a good situation to be in. Storms are generally not a good place to be in. We got caught, my mother and father were out with us in the Philippines with Melody once, we got caught in a flood once, where the taxi driver who was in was floating along this flood in Manila. You know, suddenly this flash flood came and literally the car, you know, and the car was sort of like filling up with water, and I had to tell the taxi driver what to do because he had the aircon on and everything. I said, you need to turn that off because it will suck the water up into the engine and so forth, and he did. Unfortunately, the car floated onto hard ground and we managed to drive again through this. But it's an unpleasant experience. You know, it's a time of anxiety and stress. But I have learnt and I have discovered that it's possible to actually realise that if God's made promises to us, he will fulfil them. So have calm, have confidence, have faith in the middle of the storm. And God was going to get Paul to Rome in front of Caesar, whatever it took. I'll just tell you this story as we start to draw to a close, and I'll give you the fourth anchor. Robert Bruce of Scotland was running for his life, fleeing persecutors. And he ducked into a small cave, and a spider immediately appeared and spun a web over the opening. And so his pursuers fanned across the landscape, knowing he was near. And as two of them approached the cave, and one of them started to go in, the other one stopped and says, "Don't bother. This is the cave we was hiding in." He said, "There's a spider web over it." He said, "It's not possible for somebody to get into the cave without breaking the web." So here he was, just hiding a few feet away, listening to this conversation this men had had, when the spider had just woven the web. And he said it was the providence of God. He said, "I really felt that was God's providence, God's work." And he said that first he realised that God had brought me here and that I'm in his will. Next, that he will keep me in his love and give me the grace to be the man he calls me to be. And he talked in later life about those lessons he learned sitting in that cave with those pursuers outside, and about what it meant to trust in the providence of God. So you can still say, whatever situation you find yourself in, God has an appointment for me. He will get me where he wants me to be. That's the sort of faith and confidence we need to have in his providence, that I'm in his keeping, I'm under his training. This storm for me is just a lesson of faith. He's teaching me that I can trust him. And that's what I think when I look back at some of the storms in my life. And I'm actually glad I went through them. I wasn't at the time. They were horrible situations to be in. But as you look back now, you suddenly realise, my goodness, God was there. I can see his hand in that situation. I wish I could have trusted him in that situation rather than running around like Corporal Jones shouting, "Don't panic," whilst being the most panicked in the room. Faith is something God teaches us. We are under his training. And we've got to come to the stage where we say, God's will for me will be done. Do you believe that? If you say to God, "Lord, I want your will to be done in my life," it's a promise God has said, okay, then actually I'm going to use you far beyond what you could ever dream or imagine. Have the faith that God's going to keep that promise. That even when the storm's raging, even when it's around you, just have faith in that he's going to keep that promise. So the last promise, or the last anchor, the strong anchor of the performance of God. What God told Paul would happen, did happen. It came to pass, and everybody made it safely to the shore. God kept his word. He spared every life and proved himself to be as good as his word. And I will close with that. One of the reasons I tell you quite often stories about my own life is purely because I've walked through these situations, as many of you have as well. And as a public speaker, I'm not ashamed to look back and say, this is what God did then. These are the lessons I have learned. This is what I wish I knew, what I know now that I wish I knew then. And these are literally the lessons of this passage. I've realised we're never alone. God is with us in every situation. We can anchor our soul on that fact. God is true to his promises. When he says he will do something, we can anchor our soul that God will do exactly what he has said he will do, because he is faithful. We can trust in his providence. When we find ourselves in situations which are even due to the foolishness of others, like Paul, that he had said to them, "Don't set sail, it's a stupid thing to do." They stupidly set sail, and he found himself in that situation. He wasn't outside of God's providence. God worked, God acted, because he had said to him, "You're going to stand before Caesar in Rome. I'll make sure that happens." And that's why the fourth anchor is the performance of God. And I use that word performance not in the sense of being an actor, but when I look at what God has done in my life, I can bear testimony and witness that he truly is faithful at every single promise he has ever made. So have faith in the storms and trust him. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, it's a wonderful privilege to walk with you. You do not promise us an easy journey. Nowhere in any of the scriptures do you promise this is going to be easy. This is going to be a walk in the path. You tell us it will often be a difficult road. You tell us there will be times when we will face hardship, suffering, sometimes even persecution. But you have told us, whatever happens, you will never leave us or forsake us, that you are always there. Like the father in the story I told, we may not be conscious of it, but you are there watching out for us, protecting us, guiding us, leading us. So Father, I thank you for your promises. I have seen how true and faithful you are to them. I have seen how you work situations, as Paul said later on to his letter to the Romans, that God works all things for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. That does not mean all good things happen, but in every situation, your providence is working to ensure we get to the place where you call us to be. And so, Father, when we look back and we see your performance, when we see what you've done in our lives, we can truly be a people who give thanks and say thank you. In the name of Christ, amen.